They laughed when he stood up to speak, laughed like it was a joke that someone like him, a young black man in a room full of polished power suits, had anything worth saying. One voice cut through the room like a knife. "Come on, you probably just copied that off LinkedIn." That wasn't banter. That was the sound of superiority, sharp and calculated. And no one stopped it. Not one person in that glass-walled boardroom spoke up, because they all thought they knew exactly who he was. An assistant, a diversity checkbox, a kid who didn't belong in the same air as million-dollar decisions. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was who they were mocking, and what was coming. You think you know how this ends? Think again. Where do you think this is headed? What would you have done in his place? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget, if you're into stories with power, injustice, and brutal reversals, like this video, hit subscribe and stay locked in. You're going to want to see how this plays out. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop it below. We're watching right back. Ethan Walker stepped into the conference room with quiet confidence, his leather-bound portfolio clutched in one hand, his navy suit pressed to perfection, and his eyes scanning the room for a place to sit. It was his first day in the new department, Strategy and Growth, and though he transferred from the West Coast Division with stellar performance reviews and a letter of commendation, no one in the room looked up as he entered. The long oval table was surrounded by 10, maybe 12 employees, all of them mid-level or higher, all of them white. The air buzzed faintly with polite chatter, coffee sips, and the faint clack of laptop keys. The only seat left was at the far end, near the windows that overlooked the downtown skyline. Ethan made his way toward it, nodding politely at a young man in rolled-up sleeves who glanced at him and then looked away. At the head of the table sat Angela Monroe, Director of Strategy, sharp in a white blazer and pearl earrings, her blonde bob immaculately styled. She was scrolling through something on her phone and didn't acknowledge his presence. Ethan had seen her in company-wide Zoom meetings and internal newsletters, where she was often credited with breakthrough campaigns and lauded for her leadership edge. Now that he was in the room with her, that edge was beginning to show. He paused before sitting. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm but firm enough to carry. Angela didn't look up. Instead, she waved vaguely in his direction without lifting her eyes. "Catering's down the hall. Tanya can help you find the coffee codes." For a split second, Ethan thought maybe she was joking. But then he caught the amused glance exchanged between two other managers across the table. "I'm not with catering," he replied, maintaining composure. Ethan Walker, new strategy analyst, just transferred from the West Coast office. Angela finally looked up. Her eyes were icy, curious, but not surprised. There was a beat of silence before she spoke again, this time loud enough for everyone to hear. "Oh, right. The diversity hire." There was a flicker of discomfort in the room, a faint cough, a stifled chuckle, and then nothing. No one said a word in his defense. Ethan forced a smile, nodded once, and took his seat at the far end of the table. Angela launched into the meeting as if nothing had happened. She clicked through slides filled with charts and projections, discussed Q3 goals, and directed questions to everyone but Ethan. Twice he raised his hand to contribute. Twice she ignored him. The third time, she cut him off mid-sentence. "Thanks, Ethan," she said sharply, not even looking his way. "Let's circle back once we get through the real data." Her tone was pleasant enough for outsiders, but in the room, it landed like a slap. Ethan sat back slowly, hiding the tension in his shoulders. He glanced around. A few people avoided eye contact. A few others smiled tightly and looked down at their notes. By the time the meeting wrapped 40 minutes later, Ethan had barely said more than 10 words. He collected his laptop, straightened the chair behind him, and waited for others to leave before moving toward the door. As he passed Angela, still seated at the head, she turned to the woman beside her, a senior associate with a tight bun and tighter expression, and said just loudly enough for him to hear, "Let's make sure someone grabs the right creamer next time. Our new recruit seems like he'd know his way around a coffee cart." Angela Monroe's voice echoed faintly through the hallway as Ethan stepped back into his cubicle. "Diversity hire," the phrase still ringing in his ears like a quiet insult that refused to fade. He didn't respond that morning. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't challenged her in front of the team. But that didn't mean he hadn't noticed. And it didn't mean he'd forgotten. The days that followed confirmed his suspicions. What happened in that meeting wasn't a one-time misstep. It was the beginning of a pattern. On Monday, Ethan sent Angela an email with 3 campaign concepts tied to their upcoming rollout for a client in Chicago. He stayed late to ensure the data was correct, the slides clean, the language precise. Tuesday morning, she never responded. By noon, he circled back with a polite follow-up. No reply. When he gently asked her during a hallway pass if she'd had time to review it, she smiled coldly and said, "Didn't see it. Try again later." But he knew she had. He'd seen the read receipt. Later that same week, the team gathered for a strategy review. Angela stood at the front of the room, walking the group through potential growth initiatives, most of which, Ethan noticed, mirrored the very ideas he had submitted. Word for word, line for line. And yet, she never once mentioned his name. "As we've been exploring," she said casually, clicking through slides, "this client segment could be optimized with a tiered retention strategy." Ethan stared at the screen, at the bar graphs and bullet points he had built over the past 4 days, and said nothing. His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. He didn't want to give her the satisfaction of watching him react. After the meeting, he approached her privately in the hallway. "I noticed some of my work was in today's deck," he said carefully, his tone level. Angela didn't blink. "Oh, that's funny. I thought we all contributed to that." She said it with a sweet smile and steel in her eyes, then turned on her heel and walked away, leaving him standing there with the taste of bile in his throat. 2 days later, Ethan's access to one of the internal data systems mysteriously changed. Without it, he couldn't pull the reporting dashboards needed for next week's client presentation. He emailed IT. They replied that access had been revoked at the request of department leadership. He wrote again, this time copying Angela and asking for clarification. She replied curtly, "That platform's above your pay grade, Ethan. Focus on your assigned scope." That Friday, just before 5, Angela stopped by his desk with a stack of documents, 30 pages thick, unformatted, unfiltered raw data, and dropped them with a loud thud. "The client wants these sorted and visualized by Monday morning. Should be no problem for someone with your background." Then she walked off. No thanks. No offer to help. No clarification. Just assumption and order. It wasn't the workload that got under Ethan's skin. It was the way she said it. Your background. As if she were referring to something other than his degree from MIT or his 4 years of experience optimizing enterprise systems. As if she were reminding him again of how she saw him. Not as a peer, not as a rising analyst, but as a name in a checkbox. That night, Ethan stayed in the office until nearly midnight. He built the dashboards from scratch, cross-referenced the numbers twice, and formatted everything in a layout so polished it could have gone to print. But on Monday morning, when he handed her the completed report, Angela barely glanced at it. "Just leave it on my desk," she said, not even bothering to thank him. By Tuesday, she had repackaged it as her own and sent it directly to the regional director, with no mention of his involvement. In the next team meeting, Angela praised the final dashboard. "Exactly what I envisioned," she said, while Ethan sat silently across the table. His hand rested on the table's edge, fingers twitching slightly. No one in the room acknowledged him. No one looked in his direction. If anyone suspected the truth, they said nothing. Later that day, he overheard 2 coworkers chatting by the coffee machine. One said, "Isn't it crazy how Angela just comes up with these things out of nowhere?" The other replied, "Well, I mean she's been here forever. Maybe she just knows how to take initiative." Ethan walked past them without a word, their voices sticking to his shoulders like humidity. Angela's tactics escalated swiftly after that Monday. If before her moves were subtle, clever deflections and quiet erasures, now she had grown bolder. With each passing week, her disdain grew more public, more deliberate, and more ruthless. On the 3rd Thursday of Ethan's tenure with her team, a company-wide strategic alignment meeting was held in the executive boardroom. Every department head and high-level analyst was present. Ethan, assigned to present a competitive breakdown he'd spent 4 nights refining, stood with his notes in hand and the company's logo glowing behind him on the projector. He spoke clearly, calmly, walking the room through market gaps and growth opportunities, data that was sharp, insights that were grounded. But just as he finished his second slide, Angela interrupted from the far side of the room. "I'm sorry," she said loudly enough for every head to turn, "but is this original content? Or did you just borrow it from a marketing blog somewhere?" The room fell uncomfortably silent. 1 or 2 people chuckled nervously. Ethan blinked once, steadying his breath, and replied, "All research is sourced and cited, but the analysis is mine." Angela smiled, her arms folded. Hum, she said flatly, then turned to the room. "We've got to be careful about parroting what we find on Google. Nothing screams amateur like a presentation that could have been built in Canva by an intern." Someone near the back let out a stifled laugh. Ethan looked around. No one spoke up. Not the team lead from finance, who had reviewed his draft. Not the director from marketing, who had praised the early mock-up. They all kept their heads down. Angela waved a hand, dismissing the rest of his talk. "Let's move on. We'll circle back if there's time." Ethan stood there for 3 full seconds, then closed his laptop. He returned to his seat, spine straight, eyes locked ahead. Inside, his lungs were tight, but his face remained unreadable. Later that evening, well past 8, as most of the office cleared out, Ethan sat at his desk making quiet edits to the monthly report. Angela approached, holding a stack of binders nearly a foot thick. She didn't ask if he was busy. She didn't acknowledge the humiliation earlier. She simply dropped the binders on his desk and said, "We need copies of everything for tomorrow's compliance audit. Sort, print, staple, collate. Hard copies, full color. 50 sets. It's basic work, nothing too advanced, so it shouldn't take you long." Ethan looked up. "This is over 400 pages. Angela smiled like she'd just handed him a coffee order. "Exactly. Use the high-capacity printer in the mailroom. I assume you know how to work one of those." She didn't wait for his response. She turned and left. That night, the hum of the fluorescent lights in the mailroom buzzed over Ethan's head like a second insult. Alone under pale light, he printed page after page, file after file, each one a reminder of where he stood in Angela's eyes. Not as an analyst, not as a professional, but as someone meant to serve. When he finally packed the last binder and sealed the box, it was 1:27 a.m. He stared at his reflection in the mailroom window, tired eyes rolled up sleeves, the quiet ache in his neck, and felt a flicker of something shift. He wasn't angry, not exactly, but he was awake now in a way he hadn't been before. The next morning, Angela walked past his desk and said sweetly, "Coffee's running low in the break room. You might want to check on that." Ethan arrived at the office on Monday with dark circles beneath his eyes, the memory of a humiliating late-night printing session still fresh, but his expression unreadable as always. Over the weekend, he had added 2 more entries to his internal log, time-stamped notes, audio clips, and his personal reflections, all meticulously labeled. He knew now that Angela wasn't just aggressive. She was calculated, patient in her cruelty, and always several moves ahead. That morning, as he passed by the coffee station, 2 junior analysts abruptly lowered their voices mid-conversation. One of them glanced at Ethan, then whispered something that made the other chuckle uncomfortably. He caught only a fragment, something about HR quotas and performance padding. It wasn't the first time. For the last 2 weeks, whispers had followed him wherever he went, subtle comments about how he must have known someone in HR, jokes about diversity hires that never quite named him, but always landed close enough. Ethan had built a career on his merit, not on favors or initiatives, yet the story circulating around the office told a different version, one Angela had carefully planted and nurtured. He discovered this firsthand during a lunch meeting with Zachary Lang, a product lead who had once expressed interest in Ethan's ideas. As they chatted over sandwiches, Zach leaned in and asked, with a forced casualness, "So, how's it feel jumping straight from training into the big leagues?" Ethan blinked, confused. "I've been with the company for 3 years," he said evenly. Zach hesitated. "All right. I just figured. I mean, With how fast they brought you onto strategy, I thought it was part of the... He stopped himself, but the damage was done. Later that afternoon, Ethan overheard Angela speaking to a new hire by the break room, her voice smooth and disarming. "We try to give everyone a fair chance here," she said. "Some hires come in through different channels, internal programs, HR partnerships. It's not always about experience, but potential." She said it loudly enough for Ethan to hear, yet softly enough to remain technically deniable. Then came the project. The rollout for the company's largest logistics client was kicking off, a multi-quarter strategy plan with millions at stake. Ethan had been involved in the prep work, attended the early stakeholder calls, and even submitted a 3-phase roadmap proposal. At the Friday sync, his name was on the preliminary contributor list. But by Tuesday, when the project roles were finalized, his name was missing. He opened the internal dashboard 3 times to make sure. Instead, he found a note in his inbox from Angela. "We've decided to move in a different direction. At this stage, the project requires more senior insight. I'm sure you understand. No signature. No room for conversation." He responded politely, asking for clarification. What specific qualification did he lack? And how could he improve for future opportunities? She never replied. That evening, Ethan sat in the empty common room, staring at the long whiteboard where project ideas were once sketched. His own notes, still visible in faint marker, had been erased and rewritten by someone else, but the structure, the formatting, even the bullet styles were unmistakably his. Another analyst, promoted ahead of him last quarter, now presented those concepts in team huddles like they were original. Ethan didn't interrupt. He didn't protest. He watched and took notes. By Wednesday, Angela had begun excluding him from key emails. He wasn't invited to stakeholder roundtables, nor copied on updates he once handled directly. When Ethan asked a team lead if there had been a change in reporting lines, the man shrugged and said, "Angela told me you were shifting focus." Shifting focus. That phrase became another entry in Ethan's private file, which now spanned 16 pages and was backed up on 3 drives. It wasn't just what Angela said, it was how she said it, and who she said it to. She never shouted, never cursed, never threatened. She simply planted ideas, small enough to pass as harmless, but sharp enough to cut through his credibility 1 layer at a time. After weeks of having his ideas ignored, his access revoked, and his credibility chipped away by rumor and innuendo, he began to notice something more dangerous unfolding. A coordinated effort to turn even his smallest tasks into potential traps. It began with a budget report for a smaller client, something routine, not tied to the high-stakes projects he was now excluded from. Angela assigned it to him with a passive-aggressive email. "Since you're no longer swamped with strategy, maybe you can handle this." The instructions were vague. There were 2 conflicting budget templates in the shared folder, and no clear timeline was provided. Ethan, careful as always, chose the more recent version, double-checked the figures against the last financial report, and submitted the document to Angela by her requested deadline. She didn't respond. 2 days later, during a compliance review, the CFO flagged a discrepancy, a formatting issue in the expense classification. It wasn't a critical error, but Angela treated it like a security breach. She forwarded the mistake to HR and CC'd 3 directors, writing, "We may need to discuss the risk of misrepresentation in sensitive financial materials." That line alone sent HR into a frenzy. Ethan was summoned for a clarification meeting, during which he calmly explained his process and showed them the timestamped files. He also produced an earlier email, one Angela had conveniently left out, where she had failed to clarify the preferred template. It saved him, barely. The HR rep looked uncomfortable, nodded slowly, and said, "We'll consider this resolved for now." Angela never addressed the incident again, but the warning was clear. She had tested the waters. And next time, she'd aim harder. Ethan returned to his desk that afternoon and opened the log on his encrypted drive. The entry he added included a PDF of the budget version history, a copy of the ambiguous task request, and a recorded voice note summarizing the HR meeting. His face remained calm, but inside something began to fracture, not with rage, but with fatigue. Not the kind that comes from long hours, but the exhaustion of constantly looking over your shoulder, of being hunted slowly, publicly, with precision. He could feel the pressure mounting not just around his work, but inside his own mind. The weight of knowing that no matter how well he played the game, someone was still moving the goalposts behind his back. The next incident wasn't behind closed doors. It came in the form of an ambush. During the weekly alignment meeting, a room of 24 mid-level staff and senior managers, Angela pulled up a chart on the main screen and turned to Ethan without warning. "This file," she said coolly, "was submitted under your name, correct?" Ethan, caught off guard but alert, replied, "That's correct. It was the task I finalized last Friday." Angela nodded slowly, walking toward the screen. "Interesting. Because these numbers are inconsistent with last quarter's data, and the formatting doesn't meet internal reporting standards. I'm wondering, Ethan, did you review this before submission, or were you rushing?" He opened his mouth to respond, but she didn't wait. She turned to the room and continued, "See, this is why experience matters. There's a difference between looking ready on paper and actually delivering under pressure." The room went silent. All eyes were on him. She let the silence linger before delivering the final blow. "Let me be blunt, Ethan," she said, folding her arms. "You're not going to go far in this environment, not with your background. We need people who understand how things are done here, not just people who look like a good PR choice." Her words weren't just sharp, they were surgical, coded but clear. He felt the heat rise in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "If there's a problem with the report, I'm happy to walk through it now." She waved him off. "We've already moved on." And just like that, she clicked to the next slide and erased him from the conversation. After the meeting, he returned to his desk, his inbox already flooded with pings and calendar updates, none of which mattered in that moment. What mattered was that no one in the room had stood up for him. Not one. A few people looked sorry. A few avoided his gaze altogether. But no one said a word. He sat there for a long time, hands unmoving on his keyboard, his mind spinning, but his body still. Then, as if on instinct, he opened his log file again, added the incident, and attached a copy of the meeting recording, captured discreetly through the auto-record feature on his smartwatch. The silence after the meeting lingered long after the conference room had emptied, but Ethan remained seated, his body still as stone while his mind ran like fire through every word Angela had just hurled at him. Not just an attack on his work or his professionalism, but on his identity, his very place in the room. Her intent was clear now. This wasn't competition or pressure or even internal politics. This was extermination. She wanted him gone. She had tried subtlety, she had tried sabotage, and now she was moving into the final phase, complete character destruction. The next morning confirmed it. Ethan received a forwarded email chain from an assistant director in finance who had quietly flagged him off the record. Attached was a performance memo addressed to the executive board and VP of operations, supposedly written by Angela, in which she detailed a breakdown in team output and blamed a single point of failure, Ethan Walker. In her carefully worded but venomous summary, Angela stated that delays in a recent logistics client rollout stemmed from inconsistent contributions and poor deadline accountability attributed to Ethan. She never used the word incompetent, but her phrasing was more dangerous than that. It sounded objective, managerial, measured. It dripped with plausible professionalism. Ethan read every word, eyes narrowing slightly, then minimized the window and opened his internal documentation file. He pulled the calendar entries, his original timeline submissions, and the timestamped deliverables he'd submitted, on or before deadline. He attached them together and labeled the folder Final Defense. Still, he knew what this meant. This was her last card. She had escalated the battle to leadership now. If it stuck, he wouldn't just lose his position. He'd lose his reputation, maybe even his career trajectory. But Angela hadn't stopped there. Later that day, under the guise of civility, she asked him to chat privately in her office. Her voice was light when she made the invitation, almost sweet, as if the tension of the previous days had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. Ethan followed her in, aware that her door had no window, that she always chose the corner seat behind her desk. the one with the power angle. He sat across from her, back straight, hands folded. She smiled. "How are you holding up?" she asked, and before he could answer, she leaned back and continued. "You know, Ethan, the business world can be cruel. Not everyone gets a fair shot." Her voice was calm, her tone almost reflective, especially when people come in thinking effort equals entitlement. He said nothing, watching her carefully. She tilted her head. "I've seen many like you. Young, ambitious, well-spoken. But the truth is, success here isn't about how hard you work. It's about how well you understand the rules." She stood slowly, walking around the desk to stand beside him. "And rule number 1, she said, lowering her voice to a near whisper, "is knowing your place." Ethan looked up, eyes steady, and asked, "And what place is that exactly?" Angela smiled wider now, cold and condescending. "Not mine." Then she leaned forward just slightly and whispered, "If you want to last, Ethan, you'd better learn to stay quiet. Know your lane. Play the part they brought you in for. Or you'll find yourself on the outside a lot faster than you think." The moment was chilling, not because of the words themselves, but because of how calmly, how confidently she said them. She wasn't trying to intimidate him anymore. She believed she had already won. She turned back toward her desk as if dismissing him without saying so. Ethan rose without a word, nodded once, and walked out, but not before glancing at the small security camera in the corner. One he had confirmed 2 weeks earlier was active and recording. He walked calmly back to his desk, opened his private file, and added a new entry. Verbal threat from direct supervisor. Surveillance log. Office cam 3A. Request review if escalated. But what she didn't realize was that time had already shifted, and the countdown had reached 0. It started with a message, delivered late Thursday afternoon through the internal messaging app. Mandatory. All senior and mid-level managers are to report to the West boardroom at 9 a.m. tomorrow for an executive address. Attendance is non-negotiable. No reason. No agenda. Just a directive from the executive office. The floor buzzed with speculation. Some believed it was a reorg. Others feared cuts. Angela, on the other hand, smiled with smug satisfaction. She had her theory, and it fed her arrogance. She thought it was the final nail, perhaps a quiet removal of Ethan, done cleanly and officially by those above her, tied to the fabricated performance report she had submitted just days before. She arrived early the next morning, dressed in power white and gold accessories, the image of composure. She took her seat in the second row, near the center, close enough to be seen, but far enough to seem humble. The room filled quickly. Department heads, team leads, HR execs, even the VP of Finance took a front row spot. Angela kept her posture poised, her phone face down beside her notepad, her eyes flicking toward the closed doors at the far end. At precisely 9 a.m., the doors opened. The room stood, habitual respect for executive rank. In step 2 figures, one familiar, the other completely unexpected. The first was Martin Hale, chairman of the board. The second was Ethan Walker. Not Ethan, the junior analyst. Not Ethan, the invisible employee relegated to footnotes and late-night printing. This Ethan walked with a different energy. His navy suit was no longer just sharp. It was tailored to the highest executive cut. A black lanyard hung from his neck, and at the end of it was a badge. It didn't say analyst. It said President and COO. The room didn't breathe. Angela froze in place, her posture collapsing an inch as Ethan moved past her row without a glance. Martin took the podium. "Good morning, everyone," he began. "As you all know, we've been in a quiet transition over the last 2 quarters. Today, we finalize that process." He turned toward Ethan, smiling with genuine warmth. "It is my honor to introduce the new President and Chief Operating Officer of our global division, Ethan Walker." Polite applause rippled through the room, scattered and hesitant, not from disrespect, but from absolute shock. Ethan stepped to the mic, calm as ever, scanning the room with sharp, unflinching focus. When his eyes finally landed on Angela, he didn't smile. He simply said, "Let's begin." For the next 10 minutes, Ethan spoke not about his title, or his journey, or his success. He spoke about culture, about accountability, about systems that pretend to reward merit while secretly rewarding manipulation. He didn't mention names. He didn't need to. Every word landed like a quiet charge set beneath the floorboards. In my first 90 days, he said smoothly, I've observed firsthand how internal dynamics can either cultivate talent or quietly erase it. My role here is not just about growth metrics. It's about cultural integrity. And it starts today. Angela stared, still frozen. The rest of the room didn't look at her directly, but everyone knew. This wasn't just a change in leadership. It was a reckoning. As the presentation closed, Ethan turned from the mic and removed the lanyard, placing it on the edge of the podium as if anchoring his presence. Then, for the first time since entering the room, he walked straight to Angela's row. She tried to rise, tried to gather herself, but before she could speak, Ethan extended a folder. Sleek, black, official. Angela Monroe, he said clearly, your presence is requested for a closed-door ethics review at noon. Angela sat frozen in her chair, fingers stiff against the edge of the table, her throat suddenly dry as dust. Her thoughts scrambled for an explanation, a pivot, some form of control, but there was none. The Ethan she had mocked, dismissed, and tried to erase was now standing not just with power, but with complete command of the narrative. And the entire company knew it. A minute later, the projector clicked on again, but this time it wasn't controlled from the podium. It was linked wirelessly from Ethan's device. A new file opened, black background, white text. Title: Integrity Review Internal Findings. A few attendees shifted in their seats. Angela tried to speak, to protest, but Ethan cut her off without raising his voice. Angela, he said evenly, I'd recommend you listen carefully. You're going to want to hear everything. He moved slowly across the front of the room, not pacing, but owning every inch of space between them. Over the past 2 months, I've been conducting a covert review of leadership conduct in this department, specifically in relation to internal ethics, HR response patterns, and systemic biases affecting project access, promotional pathways, and peer recognition. He paused just long enough for the weight of those words to land. I didn't have to do this. I wasn't even supposed to be here yet. But when I requested to join this team anonymously, I was told it would offer me a first-hand look at how our internal culture really operates. He turned to face the group fully, now, his tone still calm, but his expression sharpened with every syllable. Turns out, the system didn't disappoint. It showed me everything I needed to see. Angela shifted in her seat, crossing her arms in a thin attempt at composure. This is ridiculous, she said under her breath. You misrepresented yourself. How is that not unethical? Ethan didn't blink. What's unethical, he said slowly, is knowingly discriminating against an employee, manipulating documentation, gaslighting junior staff, and systematically isolating talent based on personal prejudice. He turned to the projector and clicked the next slide, an email chain, Angela's, from her own account, mocking Ethan's ideas and discussing how to edge him out of team visibility. Gasps rippled through the room. But he didn't stop there. Jason, Ethan said, turning toward a man in the back, your report falsified task logs to frame me for delays. I've time-stamped versions of every document you altered. Jason's mouth opened, but no words came. Melissa, Ethan continued, shifting his gaze to the HR manager, you received 3 separate complaints filed by others on my behalf. Each one was flagged, and each one was marked as non-priority. I have copies. Melissa shrank slightly into her seat, her eyes refusing to meet his. Finally, Ethan faced Angela. And you, he said, recorded stating, and I quote, this kid's going to learn what class really means. He clicked again. The recording played. Her voice filled the room, sharp, dismissive, smug. The words echoed with a clarity that didn't allow room for denial. Ethan didn't have to add commentary. The silence said enough. Angela's face turned a shade paler. She started to rise, perhaps to leave or argue. But 2 compliance officers had already entered the room and were now standing near the back wall. Ethan nodded subtly in their direction. Ms. Monroe, as of this moment, you are placed on immediate administrative leave pending full investigation. Please surrender your badge and company device to compliance. A thick tension passed through the room like a current. She didn't move. Then slowly, with stiff hands, she reached for her lanyard, detached it, and placed it on the table. Ethan took a breath, but didn't soften. "Let this moment be very clear to everyone in this room," he said. "This isn't about personal revenge. This is about systemic failure. And starting today, that system is going to change." With one sharp gesture, he clicked to the next slide. A header in bold white letters reading, "Structural Manipulation Findings 36-Month Retrospective." The lights dimmed automatically as the screen populated with charts, emails, incident tags, and HR pattern maps that together painted a damning portrait of a system not just flawed, but deliberately rigged. Ethan stepped forward, no longer the quiet outsider in the room, but the enforcer of a new era. "For 3 years," he began, his voice calm but resonant, "this department has operated under a system of silent gatekeeping. Promotions bypassed qualified candidates based on subjective assessments, cloaked in vague terms like cultural fit or team chemistry. Project access was selectively filtered. Complaints were buried. Careers were quietly derailed without documentation." He clicked again. A heat map of HR complaint dismissals lit up the screen. One read that after another clustered around familiar names. "Melissa Clark," Ethan said without hesitation. "You closed 15 complaints marked urgent, without escalation. 8 were against senior-level managers for discriminatory conduct. You cited lack of actionable evidence, despite detailed attachments. Today, those cases are reopened. And as of this moment, your employment is terminated for breach of professional ethics. Your name has been forwarded to the National Association of Human Resource Executives for review." Melissa's face drained of all color. She opened her mouth to speak, but the 2 compliance officers had already turned toward her row. She stood in silence, gathered her bag, and walked out without protest, her former allies avoiding her eyes as she passed. Ethan didn't miss a beat. "Jason Riddle," he said next, turning toward the senior analyst seated closest to the wall. "Your involvement includes deliberate document manipulation, forgery of timeline logs, and misattribution of team deliverables, all of which were used to support Angela Monroe's false performance report against me. These are not internal violations, they're crimes. Your access is revoked. The legal team will follow up with a formal statement, and you'll be escorted off the premises by security." Jason tried to scoff, tried to raise a defense, but his voice cracked under the weight of exposure. "You think you can just walk in here and flip everything upside down?" Ethan didn't flinch. "No," he said, stepping closer. "I think I can walk in here and finally turn things right side up." The door clicked open again as security entered, a quiet signal that the time for words had ended. Jason stood, stiff and red-faced, muttering to himself as he followed the officers out. The room watched in stunned silence, not because they disagreed, but because they had never thought it possible. Ethan returned to the center, letting the screen fade to black behind him. "Let me be clear," he said. "This is not about vengeance. This is about values. A company cannot grow outward if it's rotting inward. Starting today, we don't reward volume. We reward integrity. We don't protect power. We protect principle." He reached into his folder and pulled out a smaller packet, holding it up for the room to see. "This is a summary of our new ethics protocol. It includes a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, retaliation, and procedural manipulation. It establishes quarterly reviews of department leadership, all of which will now be peer-audited. Every promotion, every reassignment, every complaint will go through a dual review process. Transparency is no longer optional. It is mandatory." A quiet murmur rippled through the audience, but this time it wasn't discomfort, it was relief. The unspoken fear that had blanketed the team for years was lifting, replaced by the first flickers of something dangerous to every corrupt structure: hope. Ethan met their eyes one by one, letting them see what Angela never allowed: that authority didn't have to be weaponized to be effective. That leadership could be earned, not imposed. The storm had passed, but Ethan knew the real work had only begun. Stripping out corruption was the first step, Now came the harder part, rebuilding from the ground up, instilling not just new policies, but a new consciousness. The next morning, he convened the full staff in the central atrium, an open space once used for product launches and catered meet and greets, now repurposed as a symbol of transparency. With no stage, no elevated podium, Ethan stood among them, shoulder to shoulder, microphone in hand, tie loosened, sleeves rolled. "What we did yesterday," he said, his voice steady, "was necessary. But what we do next will define who we become." No one moved. No one interrupted. They were listening, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Ethan introduced the first of 3 transformative initiatives, starting with the Internal Academy for Equity and Culture. Every employee, he declared, regardless of title or tenure, will complete a certified training program on equity, microaggression awareness, and systemic bias. This is not a PowerPoint. This is not a checkbox. It's immersive, it's mandatory, and it's real. He paused only to let the weight of his words settle. You cannot lead people if you do not understand the people you lead. A few heads nodded. 1 or 2 clapped quietly. Then others joined, not out of obligation, but from belief. The second initiative was a creation of a culture scorecard, a transparent rating system where employees could evaluate managers anonymously across 5 dimensions: respect, inclusion, accountability, fairness, and communication. These scores, Ethan added, will be reviewed quarterly and tied directly to leadership bonuses and promotion eligibility. If you're a leader here, you answer to the people you lead. Murmurs rippled through the room, not of resistance, but of realization. The final initiative, and perhaps the boldest, was Q-Alert, a fully independent, third-party monitored hotline for reporting discrimination, retaliation, or abuse of power. No more whispers. No more fear. No more HR black holes, Ethan said. Every voice will be heard. Every case will be reviewed. And every manager who violates that trust will answer for it. He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't preach. He simply laid out the foundation for something no one in that company had ever witnessed. A structure where fairness wasn't aspirational. It was operational. By the end of his address, the room erupted not in applause, but in a standing silence. People rising instinctively, out of respect for a man who had endured what few others could and had come back not just to win, but to protect. Later that afternoon, Ethan walked the hall slowly, nodding to those who passed, stopping to greet new interns, to check in with security staff, to shake hands with the cleaning crew. When he passed the floor where he had once been placed, the remote row near the file cabinets, the one next to the supply closet, he stopped. His old desk was still there, untouched, forgotten by time. He walked over, looked down at the chair he once occupied as whispers passed behind his back and orders were thrown over his shoulder. Then, from the inside pocket of his suit, he pulled out a small metal plaque. Simple, brushed steel. He placed it gently on the desk, where the name tag used to sit. It read, "Respect is not given, it's enforced, and now it's policy." As he turned to leave, several employees gathered at a distance, watching, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but because they had never seen anyone do what he had done. Rise, not for revenge, but for justice. Walk back through the fire, not to burn those who hurt him, but to rebuild the ground where others could stand without falling. Ethan walked toward the elevator, hands in his pockets, gaze steady. The doors opened. He stepped in without looking back. And for the first time in years, the company floor didn't feel cold. It felt clean. It felt new. The end. If this story moved you or made you think differently about power, justice, and respect in the workplace, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next. What did you think of the turning point when Ethan revealed his true identity? Which moment hit you the hardest? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment. We'd love to know.